Mr. Chuck Schwamm and Mr. Mark Schneider. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Mike Johnson, Speaker of the United States House of Representatives.
Welcome to you all. We're so grateful to have you here in the People's House. I want to welcome members of Congress, Ambassador Billy, distinguished guests, and all of our friends of France. On this day, exactly 200 years ago, the Marquis de Lafayette entered this great half of the House. Here's how history records the occasion. I love this. I'm going to quote it. Speaker of the House Henry Clay, on behalf of Congress and our nation, addressed our nation's guest with the highest strains of impassioned eloquence, to which address General Lafayette replied in a happy and feeling manner. The House then adjourned, and each member, preceded by the Speaker, took the General by the hand and gave him a hearty welcome. So cordial and fervent was the greeting that those who witnessed it profess its parallel cannot be found in Grecian or Roman history, unquote. He was dearly beloved, and General Lafayette's visit, which was just one stop on his long tour of the country, reminded Americans that we are free and equal by our very nature. He evoked the same values that led to the Revolution 50 years prior with the Boston Tea Party and the Continental Congress. Lafayette's tour even ignited the country's first tourism boom, as families and farmers traveled by foot and by horseback just to welcome this Frenchman of valor and worldwide hero. Local newspapers were filled with attacks against presidential candidates at the time, but when Lafayette arrived, the harsh words were replaced with loving sentiments. When Lafayette visited Washington at Mount Vernon or Jefferson at Monticello and Clay in the Capitol, he was in effect coming home. Speaker Clay called Lafayette, quote, the great apostle of liberty, whom the persecutions of tyranny could not defeat, whom the love of riches could not influence, and whom popular applause could never seduce, unquote. It's no surprise that when Lafayette spoke to the House, something happened that many described as being almost spiritual. Here was the man who left family and fame to cross the Atlantic and to risk his life for the cause of liberty of a foreign people. He was the man who had refused a salary and offered his own wealth to fund the salaries and uniforms of his staff and junior officers. He was the man who survived injury at Brandywine and winter at Valley Forge, and who convinced the king to send reinforcements to support the Americans, and who commanded troops at Yorktown. Only two men, though not American, have contributed so much to the cause of national liberty that they stand fixed and honored in these hallowed halls of Republican government. Churchill, who helped save the country, and Lafayette, who helped to create it. Lafayette's bravery, diligence, and love for liberty are so infectious that when you read of his life, he seems more like a hero from a storybook than actually a mortal who walked among us. That's why today I'd like to thank you for being here as we join the ranks of those 200 years ago and pay homage to this general, this Frenchman, and this honorary American citizen, the Marquis de Lafayette. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the presentation of the colors by the United States Capitol Police Ceremonial Unit, the performance of the National Anthem of the United States by Miss Laura Hyde, the performance of the National Anthem of France by the Choir of the Embassy of France in the United States, and the retiring of the colors. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the invocation delivered by Dr. Margaret Grun-Kibben, Chaplain of the United States House of Representatives.
Pray with me. Holy and eternal God, rare is the opportunity, though we are all men and women of your divine creation, to enjoy and celebrate an individual of such character and virtue that time itself cannot contain his influence on peoples and nations, most especially on our own. It is then with exceeding gratitude to you for the grace you have shown us in one such brave and noble patriot, embodied in the nation's guest, le Général le Marquis de Lafayette, whose sacrifice of his youth, his talents, and his fortune in support of this country's fight for freedom, liberty, and justice served as a singular and stellar example of the gallantry and courage that laid the foundation for our republic. For this illustrious and faithful compatriot, who proved his worth on the battlefields of Bunker Hill, Brandywine, Monmouth, and Yorktown, we owe the homage of our hearts. Nous vous aimons, Lafayette. And to you, our merciful and everlasting God, we pray that you abide with us and equip us, that we may prove faithful to the memory of the Marquis as we receive and carry forth the torch of friendship, bravery, and loyalty from this beloved son of the Revolution. Au nom de la liberté et de la justice, and in your own sovereign name we pray. Amen.
Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Benjamin Francis Fallon, Associate Historian of the United States House of Representatives.
Mr. Speaker, Leader Jeffries, Mr. Ambassador, members and guests, it is a great privilege and a special feeling to stand in this hall today and reflect on the Marquis de Lafayette's historic address to the 18th Congress. In the current House chamber, lawmaking takes place against the backdrop of two life-size portraits. One is of Lafayette, given to the United States during the General's 1824 visit. The other, just across the rostrum, is of another founding father, George Washington. Lafayette's return to America 2 centuries ago occurred amid vast changes. The task of upholding the promise of the American Revolution had largely passed from Washington's generation. And the 13 colonies Lafayette had defended were now a country of 24 states and 10 million people, with a foothold on the world stage. Lafayette's reception in the U.S. House bridged the eras, at once honoring the heroism of his youth while signifying new beginnings for the nation. The general was the first foreign dignitary to address Congress, and his visit encouraged the country to take stock of its advancements and to ponder its potential. On December 10, 1824, a welcoming committee of 24 U.S. representatives, one for every state in the Union, accompanied the 67-year-old Lafayette to the Capitol. When the entourage entered this hall at 1 o'clock that afternoon, a packed House chamber rose and removed their hats. Speaker Henry Clay of Kentucky stood and addressed his esteemed guest. Clay lauded Lafayette as a faithful and fearless champion of freedom, who had faced the perils, the sufferings, and the sacrifices of the American Revolution, and afterward continued his efforts on behalf of what Clay called an infant, a distant, and an alien people. As Congress's foremost champion of American economic development, Clay invited Lafayette to marvel at a land transformed since independence. Clay spoke glowingly of the forests felled, the cities built, the canals cut, the highways constructed, and the increase of population. Clay turned to Lafayette, who followed with his own patriotic reflections on the moment. The general declared that, like his dear revolutionary companions, his faith still abided in American principles of liberty, equality, and true social order. Nodding to Clay, he acknowledged the immense improvements and prodigious creations he had beheld during his visit. But he was quick to affirm that what he called the grandeur and prosperity of these happy United States owed above all to Americans' enduring commitment to self-government. For Lafayette, the country's wealth and progress mattered most because they safeguarded its independence, enabling America to remain a global beacon for liberty. When Lafayette finished speaking and the House adjourned, Clay descended from the rostrum and saluted him, and the other members followed suit. Since Lafayette's visit in 1824, hundreds of foreign dignitaries have addressed lawmakers in the House chamber. They, like presidents during the State of the Union and members of the House during debate, have made their case under Lafayette's knowing gaze. Regardless of the changes America undergoes, they can expect, as Henry Clay did, that the nation's esteem for Lafayette will be transmitted with unabated vigor down the tide of time. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Joe Wilson, United States Representative from the 2nd District of South Carolina.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends of France, my name is Joe Wilson, a member of Congress from the 2nd District of South Carolina. I'm grateful to serve as the co-chair of the Congressional French Caucus, appreciating my personal French history. Thank you, Ambassador Laurent Billy, for you being here today, along with the members of the American Friends of Lafayette and friends of our beloved ally, France. My appreciation is very personal of being here today, in that the Marquis de Lafayette actually arrived to assist in the revolution in my home community of Georgetown, Charleston, South Carolina, on June 13, 1777. And we greeted the general and what an impact he had on our country. We all know France is the first American ally, dating to March 21, 1778, and when the French monarchy recognized the independence of the United States, and then on diplomatic relations, August the 6th, 1778. South Carolina really cherishes its French history, and we're grateful even today that we have the only functioning French Huguenot church in America, founded in 1844 in Charleston. Additionally, a leading patriot of the American Revolution was Huguenot General Francis Marion, the celebrated Swamp Fox. A beloved park is right here on Capitol Hill, just 2 blocks away, where it's known as Marion Park, and it was named after the general, and it's just, again, a daily reminder of our shared heritage and appreciation. Along with that, several years ago, I had the opportunity to raise money for a statue to be located in the park of General Marion. And while I was doing it, I was telling people, hey, this would be the first monument, ambassador, to a French Huguenot in Washington. And somebody very cheerfully reminded me, no, actually George Washington had French Huguenot heritage. There are other statues around. And the Marquis de Lafayette was a military leader of the American Revolution, a political leader of the French Revolution. During the American Revolution, Lafayette served as a member of George Washington's staff and brought needed French military support to the United States. Lafayette led the attack on the Battle of Yorktown, where the British surrendered in 1781. In 1824, it was mentioned that, indeed, that 50 years of independence, President James Monroe invited the Marquis de Lafayette to return to the United States for a triumphal tour of the country. During the 13-month tour, along with his son, appropriately named Georges Washington, he visited all 24 states. On December 6, 1824, the opening day of the second session of the 18th Congress, Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, invited Lafayette to address the House of Representatives on December the 10th. Lafayette then addressed the House, quote, "Mr. Speaker, I am declared to have in every instant been faithful to those American principles of liberty, equality, and true social order, the devotion to which, as it has been from my earliest youth, so it shall continue to be the latest of my breath." End of quote. And even today, we appreciate our French heritage. In the state of South Carolina, we are very, very grateful. In my home community of Lexington, South Carolina, we have the largest Michelin tire manufacturing plant in the world. So, Mr. Leader, that's 2,000 jobs that we appreciate. And so over and over again, I can tell the Wicker family of good things that happen with our association with our beloved France. And again, vive la France, God bless America. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Chris Coons, United States Senator from Delaware.
Good afternoon, Chaplain, Speaker, Leader, Congressman. Mon ami, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, et nos amis français. I, too, am a co-chair of the French caucus and honored to have the opportunity to join you briefly. And I represent the state of Delaware, which also had some points of contact with the young Marquis de Lafayette. It's easy to forget just how young he was. But when he arrived in Delaware marching north from South Carolina, he celebrated his 20th birthday in Delaware. And it was just off of today's I-95 on the not very majestic but regionally significant Iron Hill that a young Marquis de Lafayette, as a new aide-de-camp of General Washington, joined General Greene as the three of them went to the top of Iron Hill and with spyglasses tried to discern where the very large British force that had left New York and was moving offshore would disembark. They discovered they disembarked at the head of Elk, the very northern point of the Chesapeake Bay, and they promptly began their march northward. Falling back, the Battle of Cooch's Bridge, which happened just a quarter mile from that same hill, was the one first place where Delawareans fell in battle in our American Revolution. And as they moved through, seizing my hometown of Wilmington, Delaware, it was the Marquis de Lafayette who for the first time saw combat in the United States just over the Pennsylvania line in the Battle of the Brandywine. He was shot through in the calf, his boot filled with blood, yet he bravely led what was unfortunately a retreat from that battlefield, the single largest engagement of the American Revolution. And he was cared for in one of the now suburbs of Philadelphia and endured a very hard and difficult winter in Valley Forge. Young General Lafayette left the United States, not to abandon us, but following our victory at Saratoga, to advocate for us. And he returned to America and to Delaware with the thousands of French troops under the command of the Comte de Rochambeau, and marched this time southward through Delaware on his way to leading the victory referenced by the congressman at Yorktown. There's lots of legacy and lore in Delaware about what happened when he came on that visit 50 years later that we celebrate today, but one I found particularly interesting. Belle McCluskey, according to local legend, was the woman who removed the bullet from his leg following the Battle of the Brandywine, and she kept it as a keepsake for 50 years. And when he returned to Delaware, he sought her out and thanked her, and she returned the bullet to him. Somewhat odd. But said, "With this we return our heart to yours." You know what a nation values by where and who they honor. If you walk out front of our White House, there is a square. It is named for Lafayette. Some mistakenly think because of the statue of Jackson, it is Jackson Square. It is not. It is Lafayette Square. And around the four corners of that square stand the statues of European fighters for liberty, without whom our young, scrabble, hard fighting army would not have made it. The Polish, Kosciuszko, the Prussian, von Steuben, the Frenchman, Rochambeau, and Lafayette. The United States would do well to remember that at the very founding of our republic, our struggle for liberty was made possible by the arms, the wisdom, and the fierce dedication of men who came from other shores to risk their lives in advancing liberty here. And I might for a moment remind you that many other national leaders and fighters for freedom have stood before Congress and addressed us following Lafayette's address of 200 years ago. Nelson Mandela, Lech Walesa, Pope Francis, President Macron, and President Zelensky. We would do well to remember that as events unfold today, from the streets of Seoul to Tbilisi to the battlefield of Ukraine, that it was exactly our fight for liberty that first inspired Lafayette, that can and should continue to inspire those around the world who continue to risk, to struggle, and to fight to advance freedom. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Hakeem Jeffries, Democratic Leader of the United States House of Representatives.
Speaker Johnson, Congressman Wilson, Senator Coons, Ambassador Billy, my colleagues in government, friends of France, and all those assembled, good afternoon. It's a high honor and a distinct privilege to deliver these remarks as we mark 200 years since Marquis de Lafayette addressed the United States Congress, first arriving in America at just 19. The young aristocrat left family, fame, and fortune behind, pledging his life to the cause of liberty. He was indispensable in helping to deliver freedom to the 13 colonies. Returning to France, he continued his dedicated service to America, the French people, and humanity. He was a true hero of two worlds. At the invitation of President James Monroe, General Lafayette returned to tour America in advance of the 50th anniversary of our independence. Lafayette was a passionate defender of vulnerable people, an ardent abolitionist, and a devoted friend and ally to the United States of America. 200 years ago today, when introducing Lafayette to the House chamber, Speaker Henry Clay remarked, "The vain wish has sometimes indulged that Providence would allow the patriot, after death, to return to his country and to contemplate the intermediate changes which had taken place. To view the forests felled, the cities built, mountains leveled, canals cut, the highways constructed, the progress of the arts, the advancement of learning, and the increase in population." Throughout the tour that triumphantly brought Lafayette back to America before his death, the general visited all 24 states that were part of the Union at the time. Addressing the 18th Congress, then composed of 213 members of the House and 48 senators representing 10 million Americans, many of whom were enslaved. 200 years after this speech and 100 Congresses removed, we number more than 330 million Americans. Emancipation has been achieved. 435 members of the House and 100 members in that other chamber. During that time, cities have been built, mountains tamed, highways constructed, art, science, and technology have been advanced. But what hasn't changed? Here in the House and in the Senate, we continue as charged by the framers to represent and reflect the hopes, the dreams, the aspirations, the fears, the concerns, the anxieties, and the passions of the people. The spirit of Lafayette lives on. Lafayette told us in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen that nobody, no individual, may exercise any authority which does not flow directly from the nation. So let us, 200 years later, forge ahead, not as Democrats and Republicans, but as Americans whose authority proceeds directly from our great nation. We are forever grateful for the General. We celebrate our journey, our liberty, our founding principles, and our freedom. and we continue our long, necessary, and majestic march toward a more perfect union. God bless you all. God bless the legacy of General Lafayette. Viva la France, and may God bless the United States of America.
Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Laura Hyde, dramatic coloratura soprano, and Miss Kate Zarodnik, violist, performing Lafayette's Welcome, a new patriotic song.
Champion friend, Lafayette, welcome here. Huzzah, 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 to hail the nation's guest. Huzzah, 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 to hail the nation's guest.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Laurent Billy, Ambassador of France to the United States.
Congressmen, distinguished guests, it's a great honor to address you here in the heart of the U.S. Capitol, 200 years to the day after the historic speech Lafayette delivered to our eminent predecessors. I want to thank Speaker Johnson and the American Friends of Lafayette for this event highlighting the enduring friendship between France and the United States. Reflecting upon Lafayette's legacy, I will quote him directly, as we are fortunate, thanks to Vincent Boisferlier, director of the Fondation Chambrun, to have the manuscript of his original speech here today. Don't worry, I don't intend to read the whole speech, just 2 sentences. First, Lafayette says, "My obligations to the United States far exceed any merit I may claim. They date from the time when I have had the happiness to be adopted as a favored son of America." End of quote. As extravagant as his farewell tour may appear today, its purpose was not to glorify the Marquis. It was all about him expressing his gratitude and appreciation for a country that symbolized freedom. Lafayette also notes that the blessings the United States enjoys are, I quote, "evidently the results of a virtuous resistance to oppression and of institutions founded on the right of man and the republican principle of self-government." End of quote. The past 2 centuries have shown what it takes to live up to our shared values and to fight side by side for peace and freedom. Marshal Foch and General Pershing were among the many who demonstrated camaraderie in the face of great danger. Their statues are exceptionally on display this week in the Russell Rotunda to commemorate their ties and those between France and the United States. Such legacies serve as a great source of inspiration amid today's challenges. They remind us to stand united and remain true to our nation's shared history and ambition. God bless America et vive la France.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chuck Schwab, Executive Director of the American Friends of Lafayette.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Speaker Jeffries and Speaker Johnson and Leader Jeffries for hosting this event. I'd like to thank our president, the president of the American Friends of Lafayette, Alan Hoffman, for your leadership and all your help, your support. And 2 important members from our DC committee, Craig Metz and Elizabeth Reese. Thank you very much. When Lafayette returned to the United States 200 years ago, he was greeted with great fanfare. We estimate that over 4 million people saw Lafayette during the Grand Tour of 1824 and 1825. He was America's first rock star, much more popular than the Beatles. The outpouring of love and affection was palpable throughout the 24 states, and men cheered, ladies swooned, the country was abuzz. However, 200 years ago on this particular day, things were a bit different. As Lafayette's carriage moved through the streets of this capital city towards the United States Capitol building, Americans, of course, lined the streets to get a glimpse of the last living Major General from the American Revolutionary War. But this time, they were silent. This was an important moment that deserved respect and serious attention. General Lafayette was to be the very first foreign dignitary to address Congress. The significance of the day continued when Lafayette arrived at the Capitol building. Members of Congress crowded together in the House of Representatives, while visitors in the balcony above were overflowing with Americans who wanted to bear witness to this historic moment. Everyone was silent as Speaker Clay met Lafayette with warm words of welcome. Clay spoke about the progress the United States had made since Lafayette was last here. He boasted about advances in science, architecture, agriculture, arts. He boasted about the increase in population and the constant devotion to freedom for all. Lafayette took his spot at the speaker's podium, and as everybody anxiously waited his reply. "My obligations to the United States," Lafayette said, "surpass greatly the services that I've been able to render them." Lafayette was indicating that he had more to give. Lafayette was indicating he owed us more, and Lafayette delivered. During his 13 months in the United States, Lafayette reminded Americans that our first doctrine as a new country indicated that all people were created equal. Lafayette reminded Americans not with words, he did so with actions. He did so by hugging men of color in public, like the American spy, James Lafayette. He did so by meeting Native Americans along his tour, sympathizing with their situation. He did so by treating women as intellectual equals for everyone to witness. Lafayette reminded Americans that although they have accomplished a great deal, there was much more work to be done. If Lafayette were here today, I'm sure that he'd be proud of our accomplishments, but would still remind us that we must continue to live up to the values that formed our country. Thank you all for being here. Please take the time to learn more about the Bicentennial at Lafayette200.org. And I always end my speeches in unison, Viva Lafayette.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mark Schneider, historian and nation builder at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation.
Mesdames et Messieurs, Monsieur Speaker, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, illustrious members of Congress, my dear friends, please allow me an introduction. The name is General Lafayette, though I believe many of you know me far better by my name of the Ancien Régime, of the Old Order, of the Revolution here in America. And that, of course, is Marie-Joseph Polyvroche-Gilbert de Motier, le Marquis de Lafayette. It is truly a pleasure and honor to see all of you here on this simply magnificent day, this day of celebration, this 10th day of December of the year 1824. My friends, the last time I set foot upon American soil was 40 long years ago. I had returned to celebrate the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which had occurred in September of 1783, ending that great war for American freedom. So, dear friends, now that I return, and even though 40 years have passed, we must never forget how that independence was in fact achieved. For all of those soldiers, sailors, and Marines alike, French, American, Spanish, those of color, those Native Americans who fought and bled for American freedom, let us applaud them all! Well, dear friends, as you are well aware, I have been invited back to America, courtesy of your very own President of these United States, Monsieur Monroe, to be what he is calling a guest of the nation, to tour all 24 United States. Can you imagine, 24? Do you realize the last time I was here you had but 13? Goodness, at this rate you'll have as many as 50 one day. Could you imagine? But my friends, now that I have returned, I am certainly reminded of what first inspired me to cross the great ocean and to take part in this noble crusade. For friends, I first heard of this cause back in 1775. I was a sous-lieutenant, a second lieutenant, newly promoted to the rank of captain, and I attended a special dinner party, this one attended by the brother to the King of England. But unlike his brother, the King of England, this man was rather sympathetic to the American cause. We spoke of many subjects: the fighting at Lexington and at Concord, the Grand Congress in Philadelphia, and of course the great man himself, that of General Washington. And so it was, by the conclusion of this meal, I told my brother officers that I was ready and willing to fight and, if need be, die for this cause. Many have asked me, why, Monsieur le Marquis? Why would you want to go and fight and perhaps die in another man's war? For France and England were not at war at that moment. Why would you want to risk yourself in such an endeavor? Well, I believe you know the answer to that question. For this had been a war like none other in the history of man, had it not? This was a war of great ideas, of the freedom, even the liberation of mankind, a war that had embraced the ideas of the great thinkers, of what we often refer to as this enlightened age. Some call it an age of reason. Men like Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu and Locke. And what did they speak of? Representation in government of an equality of mankind. That a man, no matter what class in society he might be born, whether he be black or white, Catholic or Protestant, rich or poor, enslaved or free, should not make a difference, but simply by the way in which that person would carry themselves and prove themselves in this world. This was my inspiration. My dear friends, 40 years have passed, and I am reminded of the last time that I saw His Excellency General Washington. It was in 1784. We had spent 10 glorious days at his beloved Mount Vernon, there reflecting upon the war and the future of this nation. We rode on to a place called Annapolis in Maryland, said goodbye to many of the officers we had the honor and privilege to have served with, and then onwards to a place called Marlborough in Maryland, and that is where I would say my goodbye, but not before the General said this to me. He said, Monsieur le Marquis, I sincerely believe that the easy part was winning this war. I could not imagine he would say such a thing after all of the trials and tribulations that we had been through. But he explained himself further by saying, I do believe that the much more difficult part will be for these 13 former colonies that have now formed 13 United States, well, getting along with one another, surviving into the future. Well, dear friends, look at how far you have gone. From 13 to 24 United States, you have endured war, civil strife, turmoil, yet you have endured. And why is that? Well, I dare say it is because of the foundation that was built at the price of so much sacrifice and blood by you, the American patriot. In fact, I will go further by saying one day this nation shall serve as a beacon for all other nations to look to as the truest example of freedom and of independence. God bless you all, my dear friends, and God bless this great nation of the United States of America.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the benediction delivered by Dr. Margaret Grun-Kibben, Chaplain of the United States House of Representatives.
Would you pray with me? God of our past, our present, and our future, receive our deepest gratitude for this profound opportunity to celebrate our shared heritage and our shared values of liberté and égalité, embodied in the Marquis's willingness to share in the fight as both comrade and compatriot. Even as we have shared stories and told tales that have captured the quintessential Lafayette, it is clear that we also share a deep appreciation for your providence that allowed the patriot to return to see the progress for which he so selflessly sacrificed so much for the preservation of the soil on which we now stand. Today and into the future, may we ride this wave of camaraderie and patriotism, inspired to do our part, to risk and fight for freedom to uphold the cause of liberty. For we stand ever in the grace of your divine protection. And while, yes, Americans 200 years ago returned their hearts to the Marquis de Lafayette on this day and always, would we be so grateful that we return our hearts to you? In your sovereign name we pray. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the ceremony. Thank you for joining us today.